Hello and welcome to Biber Hunter Scam Models. In this video I want to show how I painted this beautiful 1/10 bust using oil paints after I built and prepared it with an acrylic pre-coloring. So if this might be interesting for you, please get comfortable and enjoy the show. This is the piece this video is about, the beautiful Game Over bust by KilgoreHD Miniatures. The bust itself is beautiful with nice details like the patches on the sleeve, sweet texture and cool accessories like a worn out too big helmet, a Panzerfaust and 2 braids. I started with cleaning the parts, and that meant removing casting seams, smoothing out uneven areas and removing casting residues. Most of that could be done with a sharp blade in my hobby knife and was no big deal. Bigger casting residues were removed with my Dremel, and I made sure to protect myself here as resin dust is very toxic, so make sure to wear a mask please. And after some dry fitting to see if everything is matching, I moved on to the next step. To emphasize and highlight details like bails, folds or patches and give the whole piece more depth, I undercut these details with the sharp tip of a brand new blade in my hobby knife. Like this, I deepened the gap under these details, making them stand out more from the surface of the bust, giving the whole piece more contrast and contours. I used a diagonally cut cocktail skewer to smoothen out the undercutted areas. This removed the biggest chips and smoothed out the roughest irregularities, preparing these areas for finer sanding. And with ultra fine quadruple zero steel wool, I then sanded all areas I treated with undercutting, cleaning off casting residues or even small irregularities in the bust surface, making sure I have a super fine and smooth foundation for my later painting. For better handling while painting, and as the bust needs a rod anyway to be placed in a base, I drilled holes in all pieces and placed them on toothpicks or a metal rod. I here again made sure to protect myself from the resin dust and cleaned my workbench afterwards. And now I could place it in my professional painting stand. Of course, not only my workbench but also the bust itself and all the other pieces were very dirty from all the sanding, drilling and scribing, and grease for my fingers. So I gave all parts a first good cleaning in soapy water to brush off all the dust and grease. And I sped up the drying process with my airbrush. To prepare the smooth resin surface for paint, I sprayed all pieces with Modeler's World degreaser. This not only removes the last bits of dirt and grease, it also seems to roughen the surface and make it more grippy, allowing the paint to adhere better. And if you want to be super sure, you can apply this stuff by brush for additional mechanical cleaning. Now I was good to apply the primer, and I chose on Mr. Surfacer diluted with Modeler's World leveling thinner. This combination works great for spraying and a super fine and smooth finish. I started to apply the primer in thin layers, making sure to not flood the details, building up the opacity until I was rewarded with a tasty brown result. Of course, all additional parts like the helmet, Panzerfaust and braids were also primed, and then I was good to go for the next step. Pre-coloring. To work out the contours and the darker and lighter areas, I started the pre-coloring of the face by spraying the darker paint over the whole skin area like a base paint. The paint was very strong diluted and I worked with very low pressure, so I had good control over the amount of paint and could apply it very precise. As a counterpart to the dark paint, I applied the lighter paint sprayed from above in a flat angle, so only the raised and to light exposed areas were hit, creating me a roadmap where to place the darker or lighter oil paints in the later brush painting stage. Next I wanted to pre-color the jacket, so I had to protect the face from overspray. So I wrapped some masking putty around the head, using a toothpick to push it around and in place, making sure the skin area is completely covered and hidden. This masking putty is really great, as it's very flexible and can get removed without residues or damaging the paint. Now I could start to spray the jacket, again starting with the darker paint as a base paint and then spraying the lighter paint from above. By the way, if you are curious about the trigger style airbrush I'm using here, I made a very detailed unboxing, testing and cleaning video to this. And if you are maybe in need of one or didn't find your perfect match so far, I can offer you a 10% discount code on this or any other gallery product with a link in the description of this video. The Panzerfaust and helmet were also pre-colored as a foundation for later oil paints. And that's the result of the airbrush pre-coloring. Let's finally get some brushes. I decided to pre-color the blouse and the scarf as well, but by brush. Especially the blouse has the deepest points of the whole bust, and I wanted to make sure I don't have to mess around later too much with oil paints and have a good looking foundation. So I used a medium grey for the later white blouse and some matching colors for the scarf and knot. I also like to paint the eyes with acrylics before painting the face with oil paints. This gives me a better feeling for the expression of the face, and I don't want to mess around with acrylics on the finished face afterwards. So I started with an almost white paint to base paint the eyeballs. Of course I tried to work as accurate as possible here to make my life easier later. Next I grabbed me some dark brown paint and painted the general shape of the colored parts of the eyes. This dark brown paint is supposed to represent the dark circle around the iris later, so I used it as a foundation and to set the size and shape. I decided to paint blue eyes, blonde German girl, you know, and therefore choose on a light blue paint to paint the iris into the dark brown circle, letting the outer edge brown implying the dark ring. And I already loved my color choice here, as I think this bright icy stare was looking great already. I placed the pupils in the center of the iris with a very dark, almost black paint. Of course I was very careful here, as this dark paint wasn't suited for mistakes here, so I almost stippled the paint in place. And with almost white paint I again stippled some small dots into the eyes to imply light reflections, giving the eyes a slightly more realistic touch. As the last step I painted the lower lids in this flashy rosy paint to lighten them up, as they should be hit by light, and these parts usually are very flashy and rosy. And with these steps the eyes were done for now. My plan is to go back at them later with oil paints, setting some shades to make them less bright and add some color variation to the iris, giving them more variation and depth, making them more lifelike. I also pre-painted the patches on the jacket with acrylics to finish them later with oil paints. And because they contain some symbols which are forbidden in some countries, including my home country for obvious reasons, I will cover them up with some masking putty in this video, so I don't get myself into trouble. Then it was finally time for oil paints. I learned to always try to get the best oil paints I can afford, because they have more pigments than the cheap ones from the discounter, for example, and you can see the difference in quality at the result. So I tried to get oils from Winsor & Newton, Schminke or Old Holland. For thinning and blending the oils I will use odorless thinner and liquin, what is a great medium for blending the oils, and I usually use only liquin in the early painting stage. The slow cooker is used to speed up the drying time in between the layers, later more to that, and some reference pictures are always helpful. And my palette knives for mixing the oils. I started with drying out the oils overnight on a piece of cardboard to get rid of the linseed oil so the paints dry out more matte. And then transferred them onto my palette, which is a white tile in the lid of an old Tupperware container. I labeled the paints so I don't get confused when paints are looking too similar. And then I started mixing the skin tones. I began with the darkest shadow color with some darker reddish and magenta tones, adding some cobalt blue to darken the mix. Cobalt blue is a very powerful color and it's a good idea to add it in smaller amounts. I stirred the oils with my palette knives until they were thoroughly mixed. And I like to keep my palette as clean as possible. I placed the darkest shadow mix on the palette and this was my foundation for the next paints. I took some amount of the mixed paint, added some magenta to the paint and like this created the next slightly lighter shadow paint. I then took some paint from this mix and lightened it up with some Naples yellow and white in small amounts and had the next lighter paint mixed. By adding more and more Naples yellow and white to the mix, the paint became lighter and like this I created 4 shadow and 5 highlight paints. My original plan to keep it a bit simpler this time has already been put to rest with that, but I felt it necessary to add a few lighter tones while mixing the paints and I thought I better trust my stomach here. I wanted to try to create very pinky tones here as this is a young female face and at this point I wasn't sure how they would work out, because in the past I painted only male faces from older soldiers with bearded shadows and different face colors. So I was very curious how this color palette would work out. I attached 2 crown caps to the palette where I placed the thinner and liquid in, so I have it ready and in reach when using the paints. My brushes are divided into light and dark colors, so I don't have to use a brush for painting a brighter highlight, I just use for painting dark shadows. Like this I don't have the risk of ruining a bright area with a messy dark brush. To start the painting I use these 2 brushes, an Abteilung Kolinsky size 2 for painting and a Princeton Filbert for blending. Good brushes are essential and these 2 brands have some of the best in my opinion. Then it was finally time to put some paint onto the face and I started with diluting the paint with liquid into a thinner consistency, making the paint slightly translucent and easier to apply. The paint I started with was the first and lightest shadow paint, as I like to start with painting the shadows and add the highlights afterwards. With this light shadow paint I painted all areas that would receive at least some shadows. The pre-coloring and the shape of the face showed me where to place the darker and lighter paints. Typical areas are the lower cheeks, around the eyes, under the nose and chin and the neck area of course. With the Filbert brush I blended the edges of the painted area smooth and also eliminated the brush strokes from applying the paints. Like this I could create a fine and smooth layer of paint. I will speed up the video here most of the time because the painting process is pretty complex and I want to show as much as possible how I made it without ending up with a boring 2-hour long video. When the first shadow had some time to dry, either overnight or after a round in the slow cooker, I started to apply the second shadow paint. This was applied into the areas where I painted the first shadow paint, but only in the sections that would be darker because they were deeper or more covered. The forehead or the neck, for example, will be completely covered by the oversized helmet she is wearing, so there will be almost no light. In general, we can say the darker the paint became, the smaller the painted areas were. Again, like almost always, I use the filbert brush to blend the edges and erase the strokes from the brush, creating a flawless painted area. And this is the biggest advantage of oil paints to me. They are just so easy and beautiful to blend. The transitions are almost non-existent. And if diluted enough, the layers painted underneath are still visible, building up the final result in several layers. The only downsides, if you want to call it like that, is the time-consuming workflow, with the longer drying times compared to acrylics and the slightly more complicated use compared to acrylics in drop bottles. But the finished result is always so beautiful that oil paints will stay my favorite paints for larger pieces like these 1/10 busts. I just couldn't recreate the blending and translucent layers with acrylic paint so far, so from time to time I will make a bust in oils just for the fun of working with oil paints. For the third shadow paint I used this finer Princeton shortliner, as with this darker paint the painted areas became even smaller. As this is the third of 4 shadow colors, this was only applied in the really darker areas like under the chin and nose, inside of the ears, around the neck and so on. Just in very small amounts did I apply it into the areas like the cheeks to increase the contrast, working out the contours of the face. Of course, I can also vary the opacity of the paint by the thinner paint ratio, and I applied it way thinner onto the cheeks compared to the darker areas like the forehead or the neck. The fourth and last shadow paint was therefore only applied into the really dark areas like under the chin, inside of the nose and ears and the neck. As she is wearing long braids I have to glue on later, the area underneath will also be pretty dark, and I had to keep that in mind too. Like I said in this earlier painting stage, I'm using only liquid for thinning the paints, as its blending abilities are great and this always helps me to paint the first layers. It's almost like you create a colored paste instead of a thinned down paint. Worth mentioning is that it dries out very glossy, as you can see nicely here. But in the later painting stage I will use mainly odorless thinner for diluting the paints, and this will knock down the shine. When I'm done for the day, I cover the bust under a plastic cup and close the container over the palette. Like this, everything stays dust free and the paint's workable longer. With all 4 shadow paints applied, it was time to add the first highlights. I switched to my brushes for lighter paint and began to paint highlight paint 1 into all areas that received at least some light. So the opposite of the shadow paint 1, but in the same way. The pre-coloring and the face's shape again told me where the highlights should be, and I again used a filbert brush to blend the edges smooth into the shadows and reduce the strokes from the brush. Next step was to paint highlight paint 2 into the lighter areas, so again the painted areas became smaller the lighter the paint became. Always blending the edges with a filbert brush, creating smooth transitions. I would say that maybe in the first 70 to 80% the painted faces always look weird and strange, with these strange contrast between light and shadows, especially with this new pinky color palette I mixed this time. But it's important to stay with it, as the final picture comes together basically with the last brush strokes. The later part will be about unifying all layers with filters and glazes, toning down the contrast and integrating all layers into one hopefully nice to look at face. To speed up the drying time between the single layers, I place the bust into my slow cooker, an electric cooking pot. After around 20 minutes on low, the piece is dry enough for the next layer, but give it a few minutes to cool down, as the thinner will crystallize on the warm surface. And it's a good idea to use this only between light or dark layers. If you want to switch from shadows to highlights or vice versa, I recommend to let it dry overnight. And don't forget to set yourself a timer so you don't overcook the piece because you forget it in there, what can result in a pretty bad surprise, as you can see in Small Soldier's Popeye bust video. After Highlight Paint 2 came Highlight Paint 3, again blended into the previously painted layers, blended smooth with the blending brush, applied in smaller areas that receive more light. This was the last highlight paint for now, as I used the last 2 of the 5 highlight paints later. I now wanted to start the blending and detailing process, and after I gave the head a full day to dry, I flooded the whole surface with odorless thinner in preparation for a filter. In this still wet thinner, I applied a very thin layer of golden baroque red, an orangish red tone, what gives some rosiness to the white highlights and some warmth to the shadows. I then used the golden baroque red, slightly thicker, and painted it into the shadowed areas. I started carefully here because this paint is pretty strong and you can here see the warmth it added to the face. But as this was my approach on the male busts I made in the past, I here realized that it knocked down the pinky tones too much, as I wanted this female face look different to the male ones I painted before. So I made a mix with the golden baroque red and magenta paint, making this mix more pinky, which turned the orangish shadows back into a pinky direction. Worth mentioning is that from now on I mainly use odorless thinner and no liquid, so the glossy shine gets knocked down more and more with every following layer. To integrate the shadows into the face and make them less dominant and outstanding, I began blending them in by putting thin glazes with the highlight paints over them. I varied the thickness of the paint here until I was satisfied with the opacity, making sure to not apply too thick layers, but several thin ones in several runs. Like this, the previously painted darker layers stayed visible underneath. And this is one of the great advantages of using oil paints. I here almost hit the spot where I was happy with the face, but I somehow felt it was looking too white and colorless, so I wanted to try pushing it a bit further, adding some of the lost rosiness and contrast, so I switched back to adding shadows with thin glazes. I choose Shadow Paint 2 because it's not too dark and has a nice pinky touch, and placed it again in the areas where some shadows would be. This switching back and forth is maybe not super efficient, but like with most of first times, like painting a female face, it's all about to try out and find out, doing things back and forth until I am satisfied with the result. And maybe the most important thing you need for bust painting with oils is something you can't buy online: patience. I then again grabbed me the golden baroque red and added it around the previously painted pinky shadows, framing them with this orangish tone, giving the skin a blood-filled appearance. I thought this on the box art and wanted to try to recreate it, as I think it adds a lot to the whitish skin. With paints grey, a darker grey with a slight bluish touch, I try to create the darkness that is presented in shadows. Like I said, this face is dominated by the large oversized helmet she is wearing, making the upper face and the neck area pretty dark. So I try to add the natural blackish darkness shadows have with this dark grey paint. Obviously this paint was applied super thin, built up in layers, so I have good control over the opacity. And I put the helmet on now and then to see how the painted shadows interact with the position of the real shadows casted from the helmet. I also placed this paint super thin into the corners of the eyes white to add some shadow here too and reduce the bright shine from the light, almost white paint I used here. Now I started to add the last two highlight paints to finish the lighter skin areas. Highlight paint 4 was applied very diluted into the more raised areas, applied very thin so it's not too strong and covering. And of course, always blending them with the filbert brush. Highlight paint 5 was only applied into the most extreme to light exposed areas and even thinner than highlight paint 4. I here put the helmet on to see what areas it covers and where more shadows would be. So, the most bright and to light exposed areas were in the area below the eyes at this piece with the huge helmet on top. To finish the eyes I used very diluted blue paint and applied it like a thin glaze over the whole, but more into the lower areas of the iris. This changed the eyes from the icy to a light blue look, adding some shadows into the lower areas of the eyes by the paint placement. And I here used liquid for diluting the paint, so the shine it creates gives the impression of natural wet eyes. To get a better feeling how the face and the skin tones came out, I base painted the hair with dark brown oil paint, a foundation for the later blonde hair. By framing the face with the painted hair, I could see how the shadows and shades work here and if I had to do some corrections here. I really would have loved to finish the hair at this point, but because of the long braids lying on the jacket, I have to finish the jacket first in the next video. With the face painted and framed, I thought it wasn't too bad and I now wanted to paint the helmet and finish the upper area of this piece. To start with the helmet, I quickly mixed me a shadow and a highlight paint from the chosen base paint, Paints Grey. By adding black I created the shadow paint, the highlight paint was made by adding white. The base paint was then applied into the darker areas, including the shadowed ones, as a thin layer diluted with thinner in equal parts, so it's not covering the pre-coloring completely. The shadow paint was then applied into the darker areas, like the back of the helmet, for example, because she is looking up slightly and so the back should be darker. The edge was then blended into the medium or base paint for a smooth transition. And obviously the highlight paint was applied into the lighter areas like the top or the peak of the helmet, again blending the transition smooth. All these three paints were applied one after another after a short round in the slow cooker, because they in general were all pretty dark. After giving it a full day to dry, I flooded the surface with liquid and then stippled the shadow paint with a white dry brush, slightly diluted, into the still wet liquid. This gave the surface more texture and was the first step to blend shadows and highlights together. And a soft wet brush was useful for blending here. To finish the blending, I made two thin glazes. The first with the base paint with some added green to get slightly more into this greenish direction field grey has. The second with pure Payne's grey to tone down the green and integrate it into the dark helmet. I here used thinner for diluting the paint, as this knocked down the shine from the liquid in the last step. With that, the basic painting was done and I could start with some weathering. I applied a light dusk-like oil paint over the most edges and crevices, diluted with thinner and blended it with different shaped brushes and movements in a try to create an exciting dusty pattern. And by stippling with a dry brushing brush, I added some random texture to the dust. This dry brusher by Artify is a great tool not only for dry brushing, but also to add the next paint a medium brown tone. I applied the paint pretty thick by stippling into the darker and deeper areas of the dust, trying to create more variation. I then again used different brushes, dry and slightly wet, to blend it into the surface. Unfortunately, after drying, this paint turned into an orangish direction, giving the helmet a rusty look. So I used a dark brown paint and made a thin glaze over the whole piece, knocking down the orange look. And to add more dark earth effects, I stippled this dark paint over the medium brown one. By stippling the paint in thick, undiluted amounts, I also created some volume, making the paint look like earth remnants. And for more randomness, I speckled diluted dark brown oil paint over the helmet. As the paint is strongly diluted, the effect was very subtle and not overwhelming, but added to the final picture. To add some light scratches and chipping, I used a very bright paint and with a fine brush added thin lines and stippled chips in a random way. The whole helmet came out more worn out than I planned it originally, but I like the result and I think it's endkampf worthy. To finish the helmet, I used a pencil or more fancy graphite pen, and by adding this shiny stuff to edges, bolts and rivets, the helmet looked way more metallic and used. And that was it. The helmet was done and so is this video. I would have loved to show you the complete bust finished now, but it will take me a few more weeks to paint the jacket, the Rucksack and Panzerfaust. For now I can only present to you the finished face and helmet, and I would love to hear what you think about it so far. Do you like it? Was I successful with creating a young female face? I am looking forward to your feedback and constructive criticism. If you made it until here, thank you very much for watching. I hope my video was interesting to watch and maybe even a bit educational and entertaining. Stay tuned if you want to see how I will paint the rest, and don't forget to check out KilgoreHD Miniatures and Gallery with my discount code. So, that's it for now. I will be quiet now and reload my great English for the next video. Until then, stay safe and until the next time.